Hello, New Testament Survey students. This is the disembodied voice of Mr. Albers coming to you from the past to walk you through lessons 1.3 and 1.4 in your guided notes. So get out your guided notes or click over to them in OneNote. If you're one of the classes where we didn't quite finish through the Roman Empire yesterday, don't panic. We will catch up and fill in that gap when I am back tomorrow. Just move forward to lesson 1.3. I'll lead you through this and you can follow along. So, without further ado, let's start with the politics and geography in Palestine. All right, so what you need to know about the geography of Palestine: it is small, but it is very strategic. It's at the junction of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. And it contains several very critical trade routes. Okay, so it's a very, very strategic region. And I'm going to illustrate that for you in just a moment. But before that, let me also tell you that it has three regions: Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. And I'll tell you more in depth on those in just a moment. But now to the map. Okay, this is a map of different ancient kingdoms. I don't know if you can read the legend from your seat, but Egyptian kingdoms, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Roman, etc. And if you look at that, just notice how they all seem to converge right over here, the Promised Land, right? You can kind of see the Fertile Crescent here following the Tigris-Euphrates River. And if you wanted to get from Africa into Asia or up into Europe, this is the way you would go. So it shouldn't surprise us when we read through, say, the Old Testament, and we read through how many times different nations were marching through the Promised Land trying to get to other places. So let me show you an example of that on the next slide. Okay, this is from the reign of King Josiah. In his days, we read that Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. They were going to go up to fight. So Pharaoh, marching from Egypt, is coming up this way by the sea, right? And he's coming up to the Euphrates River to fight with the king of Assyria, who is off screen that way. But he's got to go along the border of Josiah's territory. Josiah is not a fan of this, so he goes out to fight against Pharaoh Necho. There's a battle, and Josiah is killed, in part because of it's an illustration of the strategic location and importance of the Promised Land. One other fun little note here, that place Megiddo, where the battle is high ground. So in Hebrew, the word for a mountain or hill is har. And so if you have the high ground of Megiddo, you get Har Megiddo. If you squish that together and kind of anglicize it, you get the word Armageddon. So naturally, in the book of Revelation, when John sees symbols representing a final battle, that battle is set at the type of place you would expect a battle in ancient Israel to be, Armageddon, or Har Megiddo. That's just kind of a little fun fact. Let's talk about the region specifically. So north to south, we have Galilee. So Galilee is up here in the north. You see the Sea of Galilee there. Jesus had many adventures on and around that sea. Samaria is in the middle, and then Judea is here in the south by the Dead Sea. So Galilee in the north, Samaria in the middle, Judea in the south. Let's look at each of these in turn. So Galilee, this is the northernmost region, and as we mentioned, it has the Sea of Galilee. Matthew refers to it as Galilee of the Gentiles, or the nations. So this was a region that was not just Israelite. A lot of Israelites lived around this sea. A lot of Gentiles did. In fact, we'll read stories where Jesus and his disciples started on the left, or the western side of the sea, and they sailed across to the east, which was the Gentile side. And so if you remember the story of Jesus casting the legion of demons into a herd of pigs, they were on the Gentile side of the sea because the Jews would not have a herd of pigs, pigs being unclean animals. So sometimes this is called Galilee of the Gentiles. And then in the middle we have Samaria. So this was in the center. It's the home of the Samaritans. And recall from what we talked about when we looked at the nation or the empire of Assyria, the Samaritans were the descendants of the northern tribes of Israel who had been kind of pushed and encouraged and forced to intermarry with the surrounding nations by the Assyrian Empire. And so over time, they took on their own new identity as Samaritans. They take that name from the city of Samaria, which was the capital of the old northern kingdom. And they lived in between Galilee and Judea. The Jews and the Samaritans did not like each other. The Jews would often make it a point to go the long way around Samaria if they were traveling from Galilee to Judea or vice versa. Jesus, of course, is having none of this, and so when we get to John 4 in our reading, we'll read that he had to go through Samaria. He just went straight through, and he encountered, among other people, the woman at the well in the village of Sychar, which was in Samaria, because Jesus did not skirt Samaria. Jesus did not partake in those social, religious, ethnic prejudices. And then in the south, we have Judea. This is the southernmost region. It is the largest region by size and by population. And it's where Jerusalem and the temple were, right? So if you were to ask where in the land is kind of the heart of the Jewish people and religion, just say Judea, right? It's where the temple is, where the priests would live. It's the city of David, right? The center of their religion. Jesus was from Galilee. He grew up in Galilee, right? Nazareth is a village in Galilee. He spent a lot of his time of ministry in Galilee, but he would come to Judea for, among other things, the yearly festivals when all Jews, or at least Jewish males, were supposed to gather at Jerusalem for things like the Passover or the Festival of Tabernacles, etc. So Jesus would go back and forth from time to time. All right, now here are the things that you might be asked to identify on your upcoming test. So I will give you a blank map, and I will ask you to label several of these elements. So you'll notice that the three regions are on here, right? The region of Galilee in the north, Samaria in the middle, Judea in the south. I will make it very clear if I'm asking you to identify a region or a city or a body of water so that you don't have to worry, is he asking me for Nazareth or is he asking me for Galilee? Nazareth is the only city in Galilee you need to know for now. That is where Jesus grew up. It's his hometown, right? You also need to know that this body of water is the Sea of Galilee. And the Jordan River flows from the Sea of Galilee down. I haven't asked you to memorize this, but this is the Dead Sea. The Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea. The region of Judea is down here. These two cities, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, are not too far from each other. So those two, make sure that you know where they are in relation to the Dead Sea, so that if I ask you for one of them, you can tell, hey, is it far north enough to be Jerusalem, or is it down in the middle of the sea more in Bethlehem? And Jerusalem is the one to the north. You also need to know that this big body of water is the Great Sea. We call it the Mediterranean. The Israelites just called it the Great Sea. If you were to label it the Mediterranean, I would give you credit for that, but you can just call it the Great Sea. All right, and I will put this on OneNote so that you can see exactly what you are responsible for as well. All right, moving right along, let's talk about the religious groups in Palestine. We will start off with the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was kind of the ruling council. It was composed of 70 Jewish leaders who were known as elders, which just means older people, right? People that have been around the block. They were given some limited authority, specifically over religious matters, by Rome. You might remember them as the first people that held a trial for Jesus when he was arrested. He had to stand before the Sanhedrin. And you might remember from that story, they found him eventually worthy of death, But then they wanted to execute him, but they weren't allowed to do that by the Romans, which is why they had to then go to the governor Pilate and try to convince him that Jesus was a dangerous person worthy of being executed, because the Romans did not allow the Sanhedrin to execute people. The Sanhedrin included scribes. Those are like the Bible teachers or professors of the day. Pharisees and Sadducees. We'll talk about those groups coming up. But it was dominated for the most part by the Sadducees. So the Sadducees are the ones who held most of the power within the Sanhedrin. Let's talk about the scribes. The scribes, as I mentioned before, kind of like the Bible teachers, they really rose to prominence during and after the exile in Babylon. So one of the most famous scribes is Ezra, the guy who wrote the book of Ezra. Why would this be the case, that the scribes really rose at this time? Well, it's really because the people in the exile started reflecting on why it was that they had lost out on the promised land. What had happened that caused them to face that punishment, that discipline from the Lord? And they concluded it's our failure to keep the law. And so what we really need is for people who can study the law, who can teach us the law, who can lead us so that we can keep the law better, so that we don't get into this mess again. And so scribes in these days and in the decades and centuries afterwards were held in very high regard by the Jews, right? These are the people that are going to help us follow God's law so that we don't end up kicked off of our land again. So they would study and teach the Mosaic law to other people. I mentioned that Ezra was a very prominent one, and they interpreted the law very strictly, right? They wanted to make sure that we're not breaking it. We don't want to end up in exile again. And so in their zeal, which was probably coming mainly from a good place, they would add rules, right? Kind of like maybe we find ourselves going from, you know what, I really need to read the Bible more often than I do. Maybe that turns into, I really have to read the Bible every day. And if I don't read the Bible every day, or if I don't read the Bible 3 times a day, or if I don't read the Bible exactly at this, and this time, I've failed. And we take what's a good impulse, a good desire, right, a good law, spend time meditating on God's word, and we can turn it into a rule that is stricter and harsher and is more of just a checklist than what God intended. And so that tended to happen with the scribes. And they got to where they would treat their own rules as just as binding as the actual law. So Jesus had a lot to say about this. He would often call out the Bible teachers of his day, saying, you're taking these human traditions that you've added, and you're treating them as just as important or even more important than what God actually says. And Jesus is not thrilled with this. So that's a danger that exists even today for Christians, right? It's not wrong to try to be disciplined and to try to have rules that, we stick to help us honor God. But it can become wrong when we elevate our own rules over what God actually says. And it can get really ugly when we don't only do that for ourselves, but when we then try to enforce those rules for the people around us or the people under our authority. So that's one of the pitfalls that the scribes fell into. Next group we're going to talk about is the Pharisees. So many scribes belonged to this group. The word for Pharisee comes from the word for set apart, right, or separate. They carefully observed a very rigid set of rules for themselves. They didn't necessarily expect everybody around them to follow these same rules. Some of these were Old Testament rules, but some of them were their own additions. We, of course, have a kind of a reflex to think, though, they're the bad guys, because Jesus rebuked them, it seems, more frequently than other groups. But interestingly enough, if we were to look at what the Pharisees actually believed and taught compared to other groups, we would probably agree that, at least on paper, they got a lot of things right. They knew a lot of things, but they didn't always follow it the way God intended. In fact, Jesus at one point says, you should do what the Pharisees say, but don't do what they do. There's a disconnect between what they were teaching and what they were actually doing. famous verse in Mark 6, or Mark 7 rather, Jesus quotes Isaiah and says, Isaiah said, and he was talking about people like you honor me with their lips, but your heart is far from me. You worship me in vain because you teach the commandments of men as doctrine. You elevate your own human rules to be on par with Scripture. Let's talk about the Sadducees. All right, the Sadducees were primarily wealthy priestly families. So actually the high priest was from the Sadducees, and they would work closely with Rome to maintain order. Interestingly enough, we just talked about how the Pharisees would often, observe this rigid set of rules. The Pharisees were actually more popular amongst the ordinary Jewish people than the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a little bit more unpopular. They were kind of considered the social elites, out of touch. And so one fun little memory device is to think about, okay, how do I remember the Sadducees were not as popular? They were so sad, you see. Anyway, somebody taught me that once, and I've remembered it. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible as Scripture. So they only accepted Genesis through Deuteronomy. And as a result, they rejected the idea that there was a resurrection from the dead, and they didn't believe in angels or spirits. So you might ask, how on earth did they get there from the Old Testament? Well, partially by restricting which books of the Old Testament that they went with. But there's a very interesting story where some Sadducees came to Jesus, and they asked him a question to try to make a fool out of him. They tried to mock the idea that people could be resurrected. Like, what if you marry more than one person during your life because, you're widowed, and then you're resurrected? Who gets married to whom, right? Like, if you've been married to 3 different people in your life, who are you going to be married to after you are resurrected, if that's really what happens? Haha, Jesus, this idea is silly. And Jesus not only says, well, there's no marriage in heaven, so you don't have to worry about that, but he also says, and by the way, you're wrong about the resurrection. And instead of going to many verses in Psalms or Daniel that talk about life after death, he goes all the way back to Exodus, because that's a book that the Sadducees would accept. And he says, remember the burning bush. God told Moses, I am the God. Not I was the God, but I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is not the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. And that proves that there is a resurrection, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive. So that's one encounter Jesus had with the Sadducees. The Essenes, all right? The Essenes lived communally, meaning they shared things in common in villages throughout Palestine. They thought that they were kind of the faithful remnant of Israel. They thought that, hey, we have to withdraw from society. We are the only ones actually trying to follow the Lord. Many of them did not marry. They didn't forbid marriage, but it was not really highly encouraged amongst that group. And so the only way they continued is by making new converts. One interesting theory, some believe that John the Baptist, since we know that he spent a lot of time in the desert and there were a lot of Essene communities kind of in the desert, it's entirely possible that John the Baptist spent some of his early years living amongst the Essenes. We know that his parents were very old when he was born, right? They were past childbearing years. And so it's entirely possible that John was orphaned relatively soon and that that's where he grew up. We don't know that. That's just a theory, but it's an interesting one. They produced and preserved what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is maybe the most important discovery thus far in the history of biblical archaeology. What happened was in the 1940s, there was a Bedouin shepherd out in the wilderness around the Dead Sea herding sheep. And what would happen is these sheep would go into these caves to seek shelter from the sun. And so as he was going around looking for his sheep, what he would do is he would take stones and throw them into the cave so that if a sheep was in a cave, they'd scatter and they'd come out because they'd be afraid by the rock. That way he didn't have to climb into these caves one at a time. And so the story goes, he's throwing rocks into the cave, and all of a sudden he throws a rock into a cave and he hears a shattering sound. And so he thinks that's odd. And he goes in and he's found that he has shattered a pot. And in the pot there are these scrolls that have been very well preserved, because the Dead Sea area is one of the most dry places on earth. And so over time it comes out that he's actually discovered these different caves that have all sorts of copies of the Old Testament and other writings that Essenes had preserved. And so there's a very famous scroll that includes a prophecy of Isaiah 53 that talks about Jesus being crushed for our iniquities, or pierced for our iniquities, crushed for our transgressions, that everybody, even non-believing scholars, date to hundreds of years before the time of Christ. So pretty fascinating stuff. But that was a group that was present at that time. And last but not least, we have the Zealots. The Zealots were fiercely opposed to Roman rule. Many of them were from Galilee, and one of Jesus' disciples is introduced to us as Simon the Zealot, so he was likely a zealot. This was a movement that sought to find a way to overthrow Roman rule. So the Zealots wanted a king who would lead them to victory so that they could kick the Romans out and reestablish God's kingdom as Israel, and maybe bring the Messiah out. So that's the Zealots. Those are the 6 main religious and political groups that you're responsible for knowing. If you have any questions about any of those, feel free to review the PowerPoint or to send me a Schoology message. And yeah, thank you all for paying attention. Have a great rest of your Thursday.